Okay, let me see participants. Right, okay, so people are streaming in. Okay. So there are still people streaming in. I will just wait, I guess, 30 seconds before we begin looking at the. Hi, so I think I'll start because our speaker is in a kind of a time crunch today, and I'll tell you why in a bit. Um, my name is Harvey. I'm a senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, and today is the first of a three-part webinar series on Mexico City. And the topic of today is on digital governance. And we are very honored and delighted that the director of the Mexico City Digital Government Program, Mr. Eduardo Clark, is able to join us for this webinar. For a while, we thought that we have to cancel this because, as you may or may not know, Mexico City is experiencing a particularly bad spike in the COVID cases. So Mr. Eduardo is also the, I guess, the chief statistician or in charge of the collection of data for COVID. So you must imagine that his job is very, very busy right now. So I want to just reiterate that we are very grateful that he's able to take his time off his busy schedule to talk to us. So I think without further ado, I will just hand over to Mr. Eduardo, and then he will tell us more about digital governance in Mexico City.
Great. Thank you so much, Harvey. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope everybody can hear me all right. And thanks so much to the university for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and I'll start right over. But before I do that, I wanted to emphasize that I'm going to try to speak very briefly, maybe 20, 25 minutes, because as you'll see in my presentation, most of what I'm going to do is actually not so much about talking of what we do in Mexico City, but more sharing with you what our roadmap is for digital governance in the city. And importantly, showing you some of the biggest questions and issues that we are still trying to tackle with, so that the conversation based on the rich experience of everybody in Singapore can be more about maybe a back and forth in terms of some of the questions that we're posing and what you guys in particular feel about those, which I think that our questions are salient for Mexico City, but in general, questions are important or all overall for everybody that is interested in digital government in Mexico City or in any other city in the world. So before I do that, I wanted to share exactly who I am and what the office I'm a part of does. We are the Mexico City's Digital Public Innovation Agency. We were created exactly 2 years ago. We started on December the 5th, 2018, with the new mayor, Claudia Sheinbaum, that got elected for a 6-year term. So we still have exactly 4 years left. 33% of our mandate is done, and there's still so much to do. But this agency was created on the first day of the administration to centralize everything that had to do with building a tech vision for the city. So before we existed, there were a lot of different agencies and little offices that were not very empowered. Each one of them had their own agenda, but there wasn't really what we considered a blueprint of what the city should look like at the end of the administration or in the mid run in terms of digital innovation, delivery of tech services, and in general modernization of the public administration for the city. So the agency I'm a part of does the following 8 things to synthesize a little bit. We manage the tech infrastructure for the city. So we have a bunch of data centers and our local cloud. We administer that and provide infrastructure as a service to other government agencies in the city. There's about 130 government agencies. We're one of those, and we provide infrastructure as a service for them so that they can focus on services rather than on maintaining, a data center and servers. We also deal with connectivity. So both connectivity for citizens, but also the way that government shares information digitally. So our private networks and in general, our own fiber optic ring for communicating and joining our own cloud. We're also in charge of digital government in terms of both citizen government to citizen services, but importantly, and it's a lot of what we do, government to government services, internal management platforms, and ways to do our job more efficiently. We also oversee everything that has to do with tech regulation, from laws that mandate how the city buys infrastructure, how the city shares information, what the city does in terms of digital services. We do information management. So one of the areas in my office has to do with uh, building the data architecture for the information that we hold as government. And then we have a value added team that does data analysis for public policy based on that information that we compile and have day to day based on government activity. We also have the purview of open government, both in terms of open data, but also regarding digital citizen participation, access to information, and so forth. And finally, we are also in charge of tech procurement. So whenever any agency in the city wants to buy anything that has to do with tech, we are in charge of seeing that process, making sure it is aligned to the city vision, that is competitive in terms of cost, and that it's also scalable and there's interoperability. So that's what we do for Mexico City. And for many of you, when you think about Mexico City, you probably think of something like this, hopefully, which is a city that is nearly 700 years old, that combines a lot of modernity, but also with a rich cultural heritage. So here we're seeing a close up to a part that is colonial Mexico, and in the background, more modern Mexico through one of our most famous avenues, Reforma, which has been centralizing a lot of the development in the city. And whenever somebody wants to talk about Mexico City, we see this city, which is a rich cosmopolitan city. It's a great place to visit. It is very, at least in the touristy part of the city, it is a very accessible place. Everything is close by. There's public transport available to everybody. And there are places that are really, really posh, that give us a perspective of a really modern city, vibrant, with a high development index. That is a part of Mexico City, undoubtedly. That's a part of Mexico City I grew up in, I studied in. That's a Mexico City I live with. But now, as a public servant, we have to think about the other 22 to 24 million people that live in Mexico City. There are the people that we, in a progressive government, want to make their lives easier. They're the people that have the most interaction with government, and the people that government interaction is the costliest to. The ones that have the most interaction, and it also takes them the most time and money to interact with. That is a city much more like this. This is one of my favorite pictures of Mexico City. You can see the just sheer urban sprawl, the just how organic this looks like, how unplanned it looks like, how hard it is to provide government services, from basic necessities such as water, electricity, public sanitation, garbage collection. It is a complex city. It is 24 million people living all crammed up. I know you guys in Singapore are familiar with urban density. We also have places that are very dense, very hard to reach, where public transport is not a given, where people take 2 to 4 hours to go to their place of work every day. each way. And this is a city that we want to work for. Sometimes when we think about digital government, we focus on the people that live here or the people that live here because they're the ones that are more included, the ones that are more vocal in terms of the relationship with government and having a position of privilege to make a difference in terms of what government does. Our agenda in terms of digital government is to reach these people. It is 10 times harder, 10 times costlier, and 1,000 times more important for a city such as Mexico City to use technology as a way to reduce inequalities instead of generating more of those. In terms of our roadmap, it can be synthesized in very few points. I'll go one by one on them on what we're doing. I feel sometimes a bit ridiculous. I was telling Harvey a few minutes ago on talking to you guys from Singapore in such a country that has been such a spearhead of digital government and innovation in the last 2 to 3 decades at least, about what we do in Mexico City, which is much more in an infant phase. But in terms of what we want to do in the next 4 years, and hopefully it is something that whoever comes next as mayor can continue to implement, is the following points, which is we need to still ensure, which is an issue that many countries much more developed than Mexico don't have, we still need to invest in internet access that is equitable. That people that live far away from the well-off parts of Mexico City have access to basic internet infrastructure, and not only basic, but also quality infrastructure that can be a way to access digital services. If we don't build ways for them to connect, anything that we do in terms of value added services, it's really not going to do the job. So, in the last 2 years, we have invested quite a bit in making this happen. So, Mexico City went from having about 75 free internet access points to having 19,000 access points since we started the administration, mostly leveraging security infrastructure in the city that was used to connect or the cameras that we do for security monitoring and also emergency alerting systems. And we became the second city in the world with the most digital access, free access points. They're mostly 100, 100 and 200 megabyte access points that have been widely successful, more than 10 million unique users every month. But that is only a first part of what we want to do for the long term. In the long term, we really want to, and we work very hard on building a long-term connectivity model for the city based on the infrastructure that we have. We have a huge metro system, a lot of public works that we can build through a bigger fiber optics network, and we can provide sustainable connectivity for a lot of people and also for the government itself. Our model is based on building our fiber optics network through a lot of investment and then renting it to private providers of internet that wouldn't have to invest on their own connectivity and their access ring. And based on that trunk network, being able to finance the access network to further off parts of the city so that we can ensure equitable access to even those people that are less privileged than the ones that live in the central parts of the city. Additionally, we are heavily investing in modernizing our local cloud. We have about 3 data centers right now. We are building a pretty big, large one that will be our flagship data center so that we can provide infrastructure for government agencies for the long run, ensuring that they have quality infrastructure, that they can focus on value added services instead of maintaining data centers, and that we can also leverage private cloud providers to ensure that infrastructure is not an issue to deliver services. We also have a software factory that is in the process of maturing. We have about 50 developers that we hope to grow to have sufficient manpower to build our own systems in-house without having to rely completely on external providers. We have built about 250 systems in the last 2 years, mostly to ensure better operation of government and digital services. But then when we're talking about something that is closer to my heart, that is not based on back office things, we talk about our digital government ecosystem for the next 5 to 10 years. It is based on building useful services that fit needs of actual citizens. So one of the things that we worry about the most is that a lot of the digital services that existed, there were some of them, 30 to 40 of them, they were catered to very specific and privileged groups. We didn't really have a way to develop digital services that spoke to salient needs of those that were less privileged within the city. So we have been working very hard on deciding what services we need to digitize, make all the legal modifications so that they can be digital from start to finish, and making them easy to use for people that maybe don't have a routine relationship with digital services, private or public. Secondly, we are investing heavily on our single sign-on for every use case that people have in digital government. We built a system called Llave CDMX, which is our single sign-on for the city. We have nearly 1.5 million Mexico City citizens that have enrolled to Llave in the last year since we launched it. And it's kind of the backbone to ensuring that when people interact with government, they know that there's a one-stop shop, single sign-on, single user, single password with two-factor auth and all those things. But more importantly, that there's a unique way to interact digitally with government. We also have centralized a ton of digital apps that were developed by all the government agencies working kind of by themselves and building a unique app for Mexico City in which we have included all the services that we have digitized. We have nearly 1 million downloads since we launched this less than a year ago. We are in the process of launching. We actually have launched it, but it's on the beta phase, our own digital signature to ensure that digital services have a way to authenticate users and make sure that those services can be start to finish. So it wouldn't be very useful if we only had a part of the process online and people wouldn't be able to finish it because they had to go to an office and sign a piece of paper. So we have been investing on digital signature. And based on that and the single sign-on, our most ambitious project is what we call our interoperability rate, which is a way to share between government agencies all the files, all the documentation, all the information that citizens provide to government, so that when people ask for a service, they don't have to give us information that government already has about them, be it their identification number, their photo, documents that we provided, such as a permit, everything within interoperability rail that can be shared through agencies. Is one of our largest investments in terms of time, resources, and even brain power to ensure that based on that, we can have, before we leave government, a citizen archive in which every single citizen can see all the information that government has on them in terms of digital government and services. And finally, the end product or a secondary product of all this strategy has to do with making open data and open digital services that private citizens can reuse. This is something rather, I know it's I don't know if generic is the right word, but it's something that everybody's doing. We are not really finding something very innovative because there's so much to be learned from other places around the world, be it Singapore, be it Estonia, South Korea, New Zealand. We have been really much more in terms of learning what people that have 1 decade, 2 decades ahead of us, we can just learn from them. But so based on that, and based on this roadmap, I have a series of questions, which is what I hope can be the second part of the discussion, which has to do with the things that worry me, that worry my team, the agency I am a part of, and that we haven't had really, that we still don't have clear answers. Because there are important things and there are trade-offs to everything. And this is something that I always want to hear what people think about, especially guys such as you guys in the university that deal with these topics. It is always important to socialize these questions and learn from each other. So I'll go ahead with them before we start the conversation, and I'll give a little introduction to what I mean by each one of them. But the main one, which I've said before, is how do we leverage? This is my main concern. If you ask me what keeps me up at night when I leave government, is this: how do we leverage digital government as means of reducing inequality instead of increasing it? How can we make sure that what we provide, what we decide, what we implement does not generate more inequalities, is making a percentage of people's life easier and making the people that have it harder much harder, or at least as bad, and making that gap bigger? And the first question that I talked a little bit about is digital government really useful in a city such as Mexico City if we haven't really ensured access to the internet? How can we build digital services if people cannot access them? We're working on that, but it's a question that really we pose to each other all the time, and we see it as a building block of what we want to do. Additionally, in the 4 years that we have left as government of Mexico City, do we focus on what we can do right now on December 9, 2020, which is building services or focusing more on services for people that are digitally included, and building a stepping stone to include people later? But do we focus on building services for the needs that we have identified of people that are digitally included? Or do we focus much more on building access, even if services come later, for people that are digitally excluded? Another one that keeps me up at night, and especially in a university such as the ones you form a part of, that I always think about, have to do with, I think that this is general in all over the world, maybe more in Mexico City than in Singapore, but it's something general. People associate government services with bad services all the time. In one part because government services are things that we need to do, not things that we want to do. Nobody wants to pay their taxes. Nobody wants to, correct their name on their birth certificate. Those are people that people are more negative about because it's not getting a reward of something better to get, like if we go to Amazon and buy a book that we really want. But more structurally, the biggest issue that I see as somebody in charge of digital government is this: for too long, government services, and digital government services in particular, have had a monopoly on people. To pay taxes, there is no competition. It's not like you can choose what service provider you use to pay your taxes. There's one: Mexico City government. This has created very bad disincentives because we build bad services, shitty services, if you allow me the word, because we know that we can get away with it. We know that even if our system doesn't have the best UI, the best UX, even if it's laggy, even if it's a pain in the back, people do need to use it. How do we transform that and see ourselves as a service provider? If Google builds a bad service, people are going to switch over to Yahoo or whatever. How do we generate those incentives within government to build better services, cater to the citizen, even when we have this perverse incentive? That's a big question in terms of the digital government ecosystem, in my opinion, that hasn't really been resolved. Also, another one, based on the limited resources, both in terms of manpower, financial resources, and more crucially, time. Do we focus on very large scale, transformative systems, platforms that will give us results, maybe if we're successful, in 4 years, in 3 years, but that will be really transformative? Or do we take an incremental approach to building smaller services that maybe won't have the overall big effect at the end of the day, but that can fix pain points iteratively through time? It is not black and white, it is a combination, but still it is important, and I would like to hear your opinion on what a city such as Mexico City, or whatever city, should be doing when we're still so back behind in terms of digital government. Invest, wait for the future, or talk about the present, even if the future payoff isn't as large. Another one that is very interesting, for me at least. As I told you, government services are things people do because they need to, not because they want to. Sometimes I think government suffers a little bit of trying to build something very cool, like we're doing a page that people want to browse, and we over design, make it more intensive in terms of attention and playfulness. But do people really want to have a cool government experience in digital services, or do they just want to get it over with? Do you just want to not think about it and just have something that works, even if it's much more minimal, bare bones, and straightforward? It's a big question. We still haven't really decided how we want to design for it. Then, doing I skipped one, but it's here on your on the bottom right. And so when we think about next generation digital services that are very intensive on having information on people, their documents, their information, all centralized in databases. In a country such as Mexico, with relatively low levels of government confidence, are people willing to accept the level of information they need to share to have true digital citizenship? Are we over designing by making systems that are very, very intensive in terms of the information they compile to hopefully make that interaction easier in the future? Or do people prefer to have systems that are independent because they don't share as much information, even if they have to do more steps, more documents for each service, but that it enables government not to have much more information on each particular person? And I think, based on what has been a global conversation on access to information by both public entities and private entities, I think it's a question worth asking ourselves. Do we want to have e-government as something like Facebook with huge integration to services that have a lot of sensitive information on each person? Or do we want to have it much more as separate things that don't talk to each other, trying to assure the privacy of citizens? And finally, the one I was telling you about that is my biggest concern, which is the last decade, digitization, the the whole the big scale adoption of smartphones has made lives easier for a ton of us. We now have easier lives in terms of how we call a taxi, how we transport ourselves, how we buy groceries, how we buy books in the internet, how we communicate. We are very privileged to be part of a digital revolution in which our life has been made much easier. I cannot even fathom to think about this pandemic for the last year if we didn't have many of the tools that we have now. But this has made the lives in Mexico, which is very disparate in terms of income inequality and access to services. This has made the lives of a select few, such as myself, to be honest, much easier. But it has made the gap between what we do and what underprivileged people do much bigger. Because those people, by not having access to services, to a credit card, their life is the same as it was before. The only thing is that the people that have it good are much farther away. How do we generate, and this is the biggest question in digital government in developing countries and cities such as Mexico City, how do we ensure that by building services, we don't do precisely what a progressive government such as the one we aspire to be wants to do, which is make people come closer in terms of disadvantages and access to services? How do we ensure that by building good government services, we just do not make it easier for some people to have it and the other people to be very far away? That is the biggest question. That is, I think, in summary, what keeps us up at night here in the agency, apart from all the technical stuff. But just to wrap up, and this is the last slide literally, this is what we do in Mexico City. We're very far away from being where we want to be. I didn't want to make this presentation as just a list of accomplishments, as sometimes government presentations can be. I wanted to be, or at least share a frank interpretation of where we want to go in Mexico City, and be very transparent that the challenges are huge and that the knowledge and experience from different sectors, such as the ones you participate in, are vital, because many of the questions that we want to answer in Mexico City have been answered by other places. And also, young new students and scholars have been thinking about those questions for a while. it is always important, and this is the thing I want to be thankful for the invitation here today, to the opportunity to listen to you about these questions that I posed, and maybe some others that I didn't, on what you think government, digital government, and digitization needs to be in the next decade, or in the next few years, as you prefer, in developing countries and cities with the complexities as Mexico City, but are very translatable to dozens, if not hundreds, of other places in the world. So thank you so much, and I look forward to answering as many questions that we can get done in the next few minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Clark. Thank you very much. So we open the floor for questions, and so Eduardo Clark will be happy to respond to the questions. I think we already have a few questions here in the chat room. So Winston is, I think, Winston, probably you can ask this question just directly to Clark.
Yeah, I see it. I can answer directly. I'll read
okay,
it.
so you go ahead, Clark. So you can do that right now. And meanwhile, we are getting more questions here. So
Okay.
you want to go ahead with this?
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll read it aloud for the guys that haven't seen the chat. So Winston Yap asks us, I would like to find out more about collaborations, if any, with civil society actors to engage within urban marginalized communities. Okay, so to be honest, most of our interaction with civil society here in Mexico City has been with a rather privileged ecosystem of people that do open government, open data, civic innovation. We have had a rich conversation with them in terms of what they believe we should be doing in the city. We have a very active open data team that has been trying to facilitate digital services and open data for that community. But it's in many sense a privileged community. I think that we haven't done really so far, and it's something that I would love to do, is really reaching out to people that maybe are not experts in terms of digital inclusion, but are experts on the needs of marginalized populations, and trying to bridge how we can use digital government to help those needs. Maybe they haven't thought about them because they are not experts in government, they're experts on those communities. And from our side, we are not experts in those communities, we are experts in digital government. I think that is very valuable to have. To be honest, one of the main problems is that for half of the life of my agency, we have been stuck with COVID, and it has been much more difficult to engage with civil society in that regard. I hope it's something that happens in 2021 after we go back to some levels of normality, but it's still a main concern for us that sometimes those two ecosystems are not so connected. So if you guys are interested in that, just send me a line. We're always happy to have in-depth conversations.
Very good, Clark. So any other question? I think we have another one here from Belinda. Can you can read that, right, Clark? So Belinda Joan is asking, could you also share how you go about measuring and evaluating the progress, performance, and results of the roadmap and initiatives?
Correct. Yeah, this is something that we do constantly. So this is something that always competes. So sometimes in government, politicians, and I guess to some degree, so that you know, I am a political appointee in Mexico City. There's still not a very robust professional civil service. So most of us are political appointees, and I serve at the pleasure of the mayor. We sometimes really focus, or our bosses focus, on the big launch, on that big presser, and that public conference in which we say, you know, the digital driving licenses is online. But we are very bad sometimes on measuring through key performance indicators how we measure success. In my agency, as I told you, I have a team of it's probably 10 to 15 people that actually do data. We do data for public policy, we do it for measuring COVID. But one of the things that we do and that we want to further do in the next few years is having internal measurement through KPIs of what we call success. And success in terms of digital services is pretty straightforward in many degrees. The first one is, how is Subtech doing based on or calculated potential population? So when I tell you we have 1.5 million single sign-on users out of a potential, let's say, adult males that live in the city, which not males, adult citizens that maybe should be in the order of magnitude of 5 to 6 million, we're nearly there. But still, we must measure based on that overall universe that we want to reach. The other one has to do with growth. Or if our services stagnate and they only peak when we announce, it means that we are not finding organic traction in their use. So we monitor very closely just how many of the services that go digital continue to be present person to person, and what percentage has go digital. In terms of success, for me, that is how we measure how much of the potential use that is costly right now in terms of doing it person to person has been going digital. We're very far away from what we want. We're nearly, when we publish a digital service, I'll give you one that comes up to the top of my mind, which is the renovation of the driving permit for vehicles. We're still, this is one of our most successful ones, and 40% of people are still doing it in a government office. That is not success yet, but that is how we measure. Eventually, we know that we won't get to 100% adoption because there are people that don't want to do it digitally for whatever reason, age reasons, even privacy reasons for a percent of the population, but that is how we measure success. And the other one, which is much more hard to measure, has to do with, are we investing rightly? When we invest in building a service, if that service takes us a month and 10% of our development budget and only serves 5 people, that is not success. That is what I'm constantly worried about and what we constantly measure, which is, with the limited time that we have, are the products that we're building aimed at maximizing the people that can use them, or are we just doing services that sometimes are very niche, very boutique, that are nice, but really are not scalable in terms of just how many people use them, and that we could have used our time for other purposes. So maybe I made a big run around on your question, Belinda, but the thing that we are concerned about is measuring what matters and having an external data analysis audit team that can give us a sense of if the services that we provide are not only growing but being used in general.
Very good. Any other question on the floor? Harvey, you have an interesting comment. Probably you can share this with Clark before we,
Yeah, sure. So, Clark, you seem to be anticipating that if a new mayor comes, then your department either will be restructured or will be gone or will change the general direction. I mean, is this the general case in Mexico City? Because I would imagine that for a department like yours, whichever mayor, whichever political affiliations, they will think that it's an important department to have, right?
Yes, of course, Harvey, that is a main concern, and it's one of the things that we need to work on. So right now, my agency, to be completely transparent with you guys, and it's something that I think it's a big learning for public administration in general, is the following. We are still seen as a political office because we were created by the new mayor. We are very attached, at least politically and in terms of the population that knows us. Most of the people doesn't know us because, as you know, people have better things to do than worrying about, particular agencies within government. But it is an agency that everybody knows that it was created by Mayor Sheinbaum. For us, success is making ourselves the least political thing that we can be, which is a service provider. If the next administration sees digital services not as a political agenda, but as something as vital as providing water or providing sanitation or providing garbage collection, That is success for digital government. To isolate it away, such as, maybe the best case is the government digital services in the UK, which is something that was also an initiative of a particular administration and prime minister, but it became a day-to-day issue. I mean, not issue, a day-to-day workhorse in terms of providing services. That is what we need to accomplish, which is whenever the 6th of December of 2024, when we leave this office, comes about, for the new administration to see us as a service provider that is efficient, that has the sufficient bureaucracy to have a life beyond politics, and that it can continue to provide services to people, regardless of the political orientation of whoever is mayor.
Thank you.
So, Clark, we have another question from a Mexican student. You can see that in the chat. So, it's the last one. I mean, the most recent, I mean.
Yeah, okay. So I'll read it aloud for the guys
Yes.
that are. So it's thank you for sharing all these insights. I would like to know what's the main goal for Mexico City regarding internet access for everybody in the next 5 years, and if you prioritize certain areas within the city, and what's the criteria for that. Okay, sure. So in this first 2 years that we had, we focused on providing internet access to those places in which we already had a certain degree of government infrastructure deployed. What I mean by this is we haven't really, dropped more fiber optics in any other part of the city or created a bigger trunk and distribution network for internet access. We focused on making sure that the connectivity that we had, that was mostly based on the 18,000 public security cameras and emergency alerting system poles that we had in the city, also were enabled to provide internet service. This has made an overall catchment area of more than 90% of the inhabitants in the city. It is successful to that degree. Most people in places with large urban density or centralized areas have an internet access point less than 3 blocks away from where they live or where they work. That is not the goal. The goal is to provide those harder to reach places with an internet access model. And so far in Mexico City, while there's been great advances in terms of private providers providing infrastructure to those places, there's still not a very large commercial model for them to drop infrastructure there. There's even places where we don't have mobile connectivity directly. To say the least, we don't even have a trunk access network. Our main objective is through our connectivity model, which will come to fluctuation because it depends on infrastructure development on the latter part of the administration, to be able to finance the remaining 10% of places in the city that don't have access with the profits of renting or trunk network to private providers. The idea is to have a shared system in which private providers can rent capacity to distribute data, and then we can use that money from the rentals to develop a larger access network that maybe won't get to 100%. But if we continue to maybe reach 95 to 97% of the people in Mexico City have access to a free internet point, for that would be a great advance to 2024. Additional to whatever the public enterprises do in terms of mobile access and fixed access.
Good. Any other question here? Okay, Eduardo, I have a question for you. So this is related to the idea of governance. So governance is usually related to efficiency, as you have described, no? The efficiency in the provision of services by the government. But governance could also be related to control, to different forms of control from the point of view of government to society and different expressions of power. How, from the point of view of your agency, how you strike a balance between this idea of control and this idea of efficiency? Because if you make a society more inclusive, the society will become clearly more demanding. And demanding is problematic for any kind of government, and especially in a government who is, experiencing many difficulties. For example, recently, I can imagine that the society could feel like a little bit anxious with all this situation, and probably what might be perceived as a lack of control or some problems in the provision of services. So my question is how you find, or how you strike a balance through technology between inclusiveness, efficiency, and control, and this demanding population, and which might be a little bit problematic for any government.
Yes, of course, and thank you for answering the hard questions and putting me on the spot, because it's something that we sometimes as government, have to and struggle to answer, which is from a first point of view. And this is something that I feel personal about even before I was part of government, even if I've been part of government for a while now, which is any sort of digital service by definition requires data to feed it. We cannot really do totally anonymous digital services. All of them required some sort of government knowing more about the citizens than it did before. In cities and places like Mexico City, with if you guys want to, I'm sure Rafael knows, but places like Mexico City that have a large history of social movements and of, I wouldn't call it conflict, but a very dialectic relationship between government and citizens on what is the right balance of government control to government provision of services. The digital government conversation is complex because by creating more services for a part of the population, and they're justified to think about it, it is linked to control. It is linked to government knowing more about you, of limiting services to people that share information with the government, and that by definition can be interpreted as government having more control of people. And sometimes people don't want that. Actually, a lot of people want to have government as far away as possible from them, especially in contexts in which I would be unjust not to mention. Mexican government has been very complex in the last 80 years in terms of both access to democracy and access to services and corruption and whatever. So when we think about digital services, we always have to strike that balance. And the most important thing for us is not to, I'm trying to find a word that is not as offensive, but not, I'm going to say it because that's the way. We cannot afford to fuck it up. We cannot afford to build a service with the low levels of trust that we have in Mexico City and then have a huge data spillage or a corruption scandal in which a politician uses that data from a service to do anything unbecoming. That is a huge balance for us. That is a huge risk. There's a ton of responsibility on our shoulders of not failing the Mexico City people as we try to generate digital services. And the other part of your question is something much more complex also happens. If you facilitate access to services, you also create more demand for services that already stretch the ability of government to provide them. Even if it sounds unoptimal in many urban planning terms, for us, this might be a controversial opinion, but having difficult access to services is also a way to limit demand. If it's very hard for you to communicate to government your needs, such as the need for a water distribution network to be plugged into your house and getting clean water every day, that is also a way to manage the demand that the demand that government can satisfy. If you build services which make it easier for you to communicate with government your needs, it also might be at some point reach a breaking point in which people are even unhappier because they are more transparent on communicating that need, and then we are not able to provide it. If people complain about, I'll give you an example just to be very, very self-critical. We launched a system maybe 4 weeks ago, no, like 2 months ago, to you to be able to get from the judicial system in Mexico City a little form that tells a potential employer that you haven't been uh, in prison before, convicted of a crime. This is something that used to be a very um, onerous procedure. You had to go to an actual prison and fill out a form, and they'll give it to you, and it made it very costly for people to get it. And it made it costly because it was also very hard for the public servants that actually responded to those services and be able to look for you in paper and in database and give you a response in a few days. We made that completely digital through through a little website in which you just put some information and they'll send you back. It broke because demand was much like 2 orders of magnitude larger than it was before, and it put us in a tight spot because the system was working perfectly in terms of the digital system. What wasn't working perfectly was the people that had to provide that service, and that is the thing that worries us a lot. A digital revolution or transformation is not only digital; it has to be accompanied by making sure that you can promise or provide what you promise. And sometimes it is much easier. Actually, most times it is easier to build a digital system than building the digital. I mean, that building the provision system in the back end of that. And that also could be catastrophic in terms of adoption and confidence in digital government for the city. If we have very pretty websites in which you can report that there's a pothole in a road and it's very easy, but the pothole never gets fixed, that actually makes people angrier at government than they were before. Because before they were angry, but at least they could complain. I mean, at least we had kind of like the possible deniability that government wasn't aware of that. But if we are aware, there's a obligation to respond. Sorry if I'm just saying that it's hard, but it is, and it's something that we work on a lot. But thanks for that, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Clark. So we have another question from the audience. So I can read it for you. How are digital, this is also from Winston, how are digital initiatives funded, and are there plans in the pipeline to explore commercialization for future initiatives?
Okay, this is also a very controversial subject in terms of digital government. So right now we fund every single thing that we do through public allocation of resources. So we are a government agency. We get our budget every year. Obviously, as everything in the world, it has been hampered by COVID. So we have to make do with what we have. I've always thought about, if we are very data intensive and if we have identity authentication services, if we have things that are valuable that we can monetize, would it be worth it for us to finance a larger scale digitization, commercializing those services that at the end of the day would be exactly the same to what Google does to us all the time? And there's not a clear answer to what we want to do. For right now, we are not doing it. Why? Because we first, and I think I don't think it's something that I will do in the present administration, even if everything goes as planned, which is we first have to build trust. I think that we would lose a lot of reputation, especially by those that are very informed on digital rights, that are very vocal and also very public, if we do something like that without first assuring that we are completely secure in terms of the information that we share, the with ourselves, how we protect the information of citizens. I think that we need to, at least in the next 4 years, first show that we can be trustworthy and then think about those things. For now, we don't contemplate monetizing anything because my main objective is making sure that things work, that we can build trust, that people feel that digital government is something that they can rely on, and then we can think about those things. But once people are assured that we will treat their information with the respect, protection, and even dignity that they deserve.
Very good. Any other question from the audience? I think it will be interesting before as a last question, probably for Clark, something related to the response. I mean, Clark has already mentioned about the response of the Mexico City government and COVID, but probably you can, for example, what has been exactly the main priority in the last few days? For example, now that you mentioned that there is this kind of a spark in the cases of COVID, what do you see is could be like the main contribution from the point of view of technology and your agency in the attention of COVID in Mexico City, Clark?
Okay, I'll share something with you guys so that I can just make clear why we are very worried here in Mexico City. This is our total hospitalizations in the city ever since COVID started. So we started getting people in the hospital early March. It really started to uptick late April. We peaked the 21st of May with about 6,500 hospitalizations in the metropolitan area. And for about 3.5 months, it went down even as we restarted activity, economic activity in Mexico City. So it was successful. It was very data driven in terms of I was responsible, and that I feel proud about. We were able to do a huge triage system for people to have that had any symptoms to text or call, and through a lot of bots, we were able to triage those people to tests, to hospitals with capacity. We've interacted with nearly 1.5 million Mexican citizens during the pandemic through that system, and we've exchanged nearly 50 million messages with them. And it was very successful for a while. We were coming down, and then starting on November the 8th, you can see we really started to go back into a respike. And in the last few days, as you can see here in those last few days, we've grown much more than we can afford to grow. So this is how we were growing at the beginning of the respike, and this is how we're growing now, in which the predictions that we do through our epidemiological models are much more catastrophic. So we mostly leverage data, which is one of the areas that I also head, to help the mayor and the city take better decisions in terms of where these hospitalizations are coming from, and building our mobile testing units that test nearly 25,000 people a day to those places in which hospitalizations are coming from, and be able to quarantine those areas. Because Mexico City, after 9 months of terrible economic outcomes based on the pandemic, we cannot afford, literally afford is a word, to close like we were on the quarantine that we had during May and June, April and May and June. Right now, it's much more focused based on I'll show you, much more based on clustering and identification of cases, one by one, case by case. These are all, for example, the cases that we had right now active. I'll show you. These are the active cases in Mexico City, which if you just see it like that, that's completely unsustainable in terms of track and trace and finding areas. So what we do is a lot of hotspot clustering to find the 60 places in the city that are our priority intervention areas. But it's much more based on using digital tools, both that come from confirmed cases, but also suspected cases based on our chatbots that are widely successful, thankfully, to orient where we want to do pinpoint interventions rather than closing the city up. So that is what we are currently working on. But as you saw in that graph, it is a grim last couple of days, last couple of weeks for Mexico City. And we are convinced to a certain degree that even if the response has to be comprehensive based on many things, it also has to be very leveraged on the tools that we have in terms of data and technology to help the city come through this spike.
Very good. Clark, thank you very much. We are aware that your time is precious and it's also very limited. And I hope our contribution, although probably a little bit limited because of time, provided some interesting information for you. And before we finish, and I think it will be interesting if you can share with the audience the questions you formulated. And I think maybe we can distribute these questions to the audience, and hopefully the audience will be able to share some input with you. And later you can you can read it that I don't know, and check the comments of our audience. Would that be okay for the audience and for you, Eduardo?
Yes, I was saying anything that you want to share with us, with me in particular, with my team. These are questions that we haven't solved, that we need to think about. So anything that comes to mind, we're always happy to hear.
I think it will be great, Eduardo, if you can send us these questions maybe, and we will distribute these questions to the audience. And we hope to hear some comments, and of course, immediately they will send you their inputs to you, and hopefully will provide also an interesting source of information for you. Okay?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, of course.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Harvey, and the audience. And of course, thank you, Clark, for your participation in this first webinar. It was really illuminating. It was a very interesting experience to learn from the case of Mexico, but also from, from someone who has clearly an interesting vision about what is going to be the future in Mexico, operating nowadays in Mexico, or what are the changes that from your point of view of your team are trying to implement in Mexico. Thanks again, everybody. Thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you very much, Patricia, for making this possible. And we look forward to receiving your questions and to share with the rest of the audience. Harvey, before we dismiss, any comment?
No, thank you once again, Clark. And I'm going to respond to one of your questions. I'll email you.
Thank you, Harvey. A pleasure to
No.
be here. Thank you so much for everybody logged in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clark. Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much for everybody this morning for being with us this morning. So, so we look forward to seeing you in the coming webinars, and hopefully we are just waiting to hear the confirmations of the other panelists, but hopefully we will do that very soon. Thanks again, and good morning, everybody. Buenas noches, Eduardo. Muchas gracias, Eduardo.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Patricia.
Thank you, gracias.
Muchas gracias.